Lecture 15, The Lufthansa Heist, 1978, JFK Airport. On winter weeknights in 1978, Robert's Lounge in South Ozone Park does not look like the control room for one of the biggest cash robberies in U.S. history. It is a low, narrow bar on Lefferts Boulevard in Queens, roughly 10 minutes by car from JFK's cargo gates, with a jukebox, a bowling machine, and a parking lot that always has at least one unregistered car in it. The regulars are truck hijackers, bookmakers, and low-level Lutchie's family associates who treat airport warehouses the way day traders treat a Bloomberg terminal, sources of inventory, not places of ore. At the center table, 47-year-old James, Jimmy the Gent, Burke holds court, cigarette in one hand, scotch in the other, a man who can move a stolen load of TVs in under 24 hours and still find time to tip the bartender like an investment banker. The bar sits under the landing path for wide-body flights from Europe, including the Lufthansa 707s and 747s that are now, according to bar gossip and FBI case files, bringing in millions of dollars in U.S. currency from Frankfurt every month. Those flights terminate not in a Manhattan vault but in a squat brick structure at JFK known as Building 261, where, people say, cash sits overnight in steel boxes roughly the size of airline galley carts. Multiply one thick bundle of $100 bills by thousands, subtract cameras and armed guards, and you get the kind of number, around $5 million on a good weekend, plus nearly another million in jewels. That makes a room full of thieves fall very quiet. Burke's crew is built for exactly this kind of opportunity, too large for nickel and dime hijacks, too small to own a casino, perfectly sized for a single violent extraction. Around him orbit men like 20-something Tommy DeSimone, a volatile enforcer already associated with a 1967 Air France vault job at the same airport, Robert, Frenchie, McMahon, a former Air France cargo employee who knows the warehouse floor plans better than most supervisors, Joe, Buddha, Manri and Angelo Sepe, experienced stick-up men, and Louis Cafora, a car thief who can source a van or burn one without leaving paperwork. Parnell, Stax, Edwards, a guitarist and sometime hijacker, is the designated disposal man who can drive a stolen Ford Econoline into a mob-controlled Brooklyn junkyard and make it vanish under a crusher in minutes. In the outer ring are bookmakers like Martin Krugman and Frank Menner, and higher-level sponsors in the Lutchis and Gambino families who will want a slice for allowing a robbery on what is traditionally Gambino airport turf. Each primary participant expects something like $750,000 if everything goes right, in a world where a solid hijack might net them $30,000 and a trucking union salary barely cracks $20,000 a year. The motive is not just money, it is scale, reputation, and the chance to be the crew that turned a supposedly secure international airline into a cash dispenser. For outsiders, mob nicknames make these men sound like cartoon characters. For the Port Authority Police Department and the FBI Major Theft Squad, they are recurring entries in case files long before Lufthansa is even on the radar. Burke himself is born in New York in 1931 and spends his childhood being shuttled through foster homes and juvenile institutions that treat him less like a child and more like a misrouted parcel. By his teens he has arrests for assault and petty theft. By his 20s he is cycling through state prisons for more serious robberies. Parole reports and later FBI interviews describe an unusually polite, almost gentle demeanor, hence, the gent, overlaying a readiness to use extreme violence when it is economically useful. His formal status in the Lutchis family is associate, not soldier. He is of Irish descent and therefore ineligible to be a made man under the rules that require full Italian ancestry. Informally, he functions as a mid-level operations manager for crime. He runs Robert's Lounge as a Lutchis-friendly clubhouse, coordinates hijacks of trucks on the Van Wyck Expressway, and launders proceeds through everything from vending machines to loan sharking. The 1967 Air France robbery at JFK, where he and a then-younger Henry Hill and others walk out of a cargo vault with roughly $420,000 in cash after an inside tip about a weekend shipment, proves that an airline vault in Queens can be opened if you know which employee to lean on and which lock is mostly theater. Burke's personal algorithm is simple: systems that run on habit and paperwork inevitably leak, and those leaks can be widened with the right mix of charm, intimidation, and cigarettes. By the mid-1970s, he is already on law enforcement radar as a major player in JFK cargo thefts and the Boston College Point shaving scandal, even if formal indictments are still a few years away. He has cultivated a reputation for paying his men promptly on successful jobs and for killing those who endanger his operations, a brutal version of performance management that keeps people both loyal and terrified. When a rumor arrives that Lufthansa's Building 261 is sitting on periodic cash mountains, shipments in the low millions of dollars at a time, lingering overnight because Frankfurt banking hours do not line up with New York armored car schedules, Burke does not hear urban legend. He hears a familiar pattern, an institution that believes its own security brochures, a vault that has been designed to impress insurers rather than to defeat a hostile insider, and an airport that has already proved to him, once, that it can be robbed. His previous successes at JFK are not just war stories, they are proof-of-concept experiments for something larger. The tip that crystallizes all of this does not start with Burke, it begins with a man who, on paper, is part of Lufthansa's defense system. Louis Werner is a cargo agent at Building 261, responsible in 1978 for logging shipments, shepherding cash and jewelry consignments into the high-value vault, and liaising with couriers from companies like Brinks. In theory, he is one of the vetted employees whom the airline and its insurers trust with millions in other people's money. In practice, by early 1978 he has accumulated around $20,000 in gambling debt on a salary that is barely above that figure, a financial imbalance that any modern insider threat checklist would light up in red ink. 2 years earlier, in 1976, he and fellow Lufthansa worker Peter Grunwald quietly siphoned off about $22,000 in foreign currency from the same operation, an internal test that went undetected at the time and convinced Werner that the combination of routine and lax oversight in the vault could support a much larger theft. When Grunwald's attempt to recruit an independent armed crew fizzles, too much risk, not enough competence, Werner starts treating his idea like any other debt instrument, something he can sell. Because this is Queens in the late 1970s, the place you go when you have a problem made of numbers is your bookmaker. Werner takes the Lufthansa idea to Frank Menner, a local bookie who already exists at the intersection of union guys, longshoremen, and low-level mobsters. Menner recognizes that a heist against an international airline at JFK is not the sort of thing you hand to a couple of desperate stick-up kids, so he passes Werner on to Marty Krugman, a wig shop owner and bookmaker with direct ties to the Lutchys family. Krugman listens as Werner describes the building, a cargo warehouse designated 261 on the maps, an upstairs vault labeled high value, recurring Friday currency shipments from West German banks that sometimes sit untouched in the vault over a weekend when Brinks leaves without a load, and a midnight shift thin enough that one man with the right keys and codes can effectively control the alarm panel. Krugman does the back-of-envelope math, millions in cash in a room the size of a small apartment, guarded by maybe 10 sleepy employees, and realizes this is a proposition far above his pay grade. The only rational move is to hand it to the one man he knows who specializes in turning institutional laziness into criminal revenue. That man is Henry Hill's mentor, Jimmy Burke. Henry Hill is the hinge on which the Lufthansa story swings from Lufthansa payroll to Robert's Lounge. Born in 1943 and raised in Brownsville in East New York, he grows up hanging around a cabstand and pizzeria that double as Lutchys hangouts near what was then called Idlewild Airport, the precursor to JFK. As a teenager he runs errands for Lutchys capo Paul Vario's crew, absorbing how trucks are diverted, how cargo manifests are massaged, and how fear keeps union stewards in line. Like Burke, Hill is of mixed heritage, half Irish, half Sicilian, and so he can never be formally inducted into the family, but he becomes an invaluable associate who can speak to both mobsters and civilians. By the 1970s he is earning well from bookmaking, loan sharking, and drug dealing, and he has participated in the Air France job that convinced everyone that airport vaults are not, in fact, sacred. When Krugman brings him Werner's intel, a Lufthansa employee with detailed knowledge of Building 261, a recurring pattern of multi-million-dollar cash shipments, and a window of hours when the money just sits there, Hill instantly identifies Burke as the logical end user. His role is informational logistics. He packages the Lufthansa opportunity, explains Werner's position in the company, and outlines how this is not a bank downtown with marble floors and armed guards, but something stranger, a warehouse in Queens with forklifts and a vault bolted on top. Once Hill briefs Burke, the idea moves sideways through the underworld's own bureaucracy. JFK's cargo zone has long been considered Gambino territory, which means a Lutchys-aligned crew cannot simply roll up to Building 261 with guns without risking a war. FBI and New York State Organized Crime Task Force reports, as well as later informant testimony, describe Burke using his status with Lutchys leadership to secure tacit approval from the Gambino side, probably by offering a small supervisory cut to Gambino-linked figure Paolo Licastri in exchange for looking the other way. On an organizational chart, the Lufthansa proposal now connects at least three major entities, Lufthansa and its German banking clients on one side, Lutchys and Gambino families on the other, and a chain of intermediaries, Werner, Menner, Krugman, Hill, in between. On a network diagram, Werner appears as the node where two graphs intersect, the airline staff roster and Queens's gambling ecosystem. His roughly $20,000 debt is the weight of the edge between those graphs. The bandwidth is his knowledge of exactly which night's Brinks comes, which supervisors carry vault keys, which doors are habitually propped open for smoke breaks, and where the night crew huddles for coffee at 3 in the morning. All of that human wiring plugs into a physical machine that is already straining under its own complexity. By 1978, JFK is one of the busiest airports on the planet, handling tens of millions of passengers a year and moving hundreds of thousands of tons of freight, pharmaceuticals, electronics, racehorses, mail, and, crucially, bulk currency flowing in and out of the United States. The cargo side of the airport is a grid of low brick and concrete structures numbered in the 200s and 300s, each serving a particular airline or cluster of routes, linked by service roads, fuel lines, and conveyor belts. Planning documents from the Port Authority and traffic statistics from the FAA emphasize that you cannot monitor every pallet and every person. Instead, you design a system for sampling, perimeter fences with vehicle gates, badged access for employees at side doors, periodic patrols by Port Authority police cars, and a reliance on airlines to monitor their own internal alarm systems. Building 261 is just one box in that larger diagram, a Lufthansa-run node linked by tarmac to runways and by paperwork to banks in Frankfurt and New York. In the abstract, it looks well defended. It sits inside a secured airport perimeter, behind chain-link fencing topped with barbed wire, with access roads that are, in theory, visible to patrol cars all night. Inside, the architecture is ordinary and therefore dangerous. Floor plans introduced in later court proceedings and reconstructed in the research show a two-level arrangement inside a single low-rise building, ground floor loading bays and cargo handling area, upstairs offices, a staff break room, and the high-value vault where sealed containers of cash and jewelry are stored. Forklifts bring metal cash boxes from Lufthansa aircraft to the warehouse, pallet jacks move them across painted concrete floors into the vault antechamber. From there, staff with the right keys and combinations admit them into the reinforced storage room. The overnight shift typically consists of fewer than a dozen Lufthansa employees, forklift operators, warehouse clerks, one radio dispatcher, and a supervisor with authority over the vault alarm panel and keys. The alarm system, installed years earlier and upgraded only sporadically, is wired to a remote monitoring center off-site. It can be armed and disarmed from a panel near the supervisor's office using a physical key and code. On paper, combinations are supposed to be changed periodically, keys logged in and out, and only certain salaried employees allowed into the high-value area. In reality, night shift culture means meal breaks cluster in predictable blocks, doors meant to be locked sometimes stay ajar for smokers, and the person with the keyring is often also the one answering phones, juggling manifests, and trying to get through the night without drama. The cargo sitting above that warehouse is not abstract value, it has weight, volume, and a schedule. Cash shipments from West German institutions such as Commerzbank arrive in locked containers whose declared values, in airline paperwork examined later by investigators, routinely sit in the low millions of dollars for a single flight. Because Frankfurt is 6 hours ahead of New York, a Friday afternoon arrival at JFK can easily become Monday morning money for the banks. Brinks or another courier collects only during business hours, so a shipment that misses a pickup slot may sit in the Lufthansa vault for 48 to 72 hours. In December 1978, that timing produces the jackpot that will make headlines, a Friday cash delivery from Frankfurt that Werner, by simply not calling for a pickup on December 8, allows to sit all weekend, accumulating with other high-value consignments until the vault holds roughly $5 million in cash and about $875,000 in jewelry. To an insurer, that is a line item on a risk ledger. To a crew of thieves who know that the midnight shift at Building 261 is staffed by around 10 unarmed employees and watched only intermittently by Port Authority patrols, it is a physically small, astonishingly dense pile of solvable problems. From a security engineering point of view, the whole arrangement is an essay in misplaced trust. The outer barriers, fence lines, gates, badge readers, are designed to keep out strangers, not to constrain the behavior of a man like Werner, whose very job description requires him to move freely between the cargo floor, the break room, and the vault. The alarm system assumes that anyone with the authority to disarm it will always be acting in good faith, because the design brief came from a world where the primary threat was imagined as an outsider with a crowbar, not an insider with a bookmaker. The Port Authority patrol schedule, reconstructed from logs, shows cars swinging by the cargo buildings in patterns regular enough that an observant employee could identify gaps of 20 to 30 minutes with no expected police presence. None of this is, on its own, a heist. It is inertia, bureaucracy, and the financial convenience of letting multi-million-dollar currency shipments park overnight in a room above a warehouse so that banking clerks do not have to work late. What Burke and his circle provide is the last missing ingredient. A group of people willing to treat Lufthansa's cargo operation as a lab experiment in how far you can push an insider-driven failure before the system notices. Back at Robert's Lounge, all of this, the cash flows from Frankfurt, the skeleton crew on the night shift, the vault layout, the timing of Brink's trucks, the patrol gaps, condenses into something deceptively simple. Talk at a table in a smoky Queen's bar. Werner has fed the data into one end of the network, Menner and Krugman have relayed it, Hill has translated it into terms Burke understands. The men in the bar joke, argue, and sketch rough diagrams on napkins, but underneath the banter there is an unmistakable shift from fantasy to planning. They have a location, a reliable insider, a rough sense of the dollar amount, and a system whose designers never imagined that its weakest point would walk into a bookmaker's office owing 20 grand. They do not yet have a date or a final roster or a fully worked out script. What they have, in the winter of 1978, is a vault on airport property that behaves less like a fortress and more like an unattended safe in a warehouse, and a growing conviction that if they time it right, they can simply walk in and make Lufthansa's numbers their own. On paper, Building 261 at JFK is the kind of place risk managers love. Lufthansa's insurance files from the late 1970s describe it as secure overnight storage for currency shipments arriving from Frankfurt, a self-contained, two-story cargo box with a reinforced upstairs vault, a night crew of roughly 10 workers plus a shift supervisor, and scheduled Brink's pickups to vacuum cash off the premises before breakfast. Executives flying to London or Frankfurt to reassure underwriters can point to that blueprint, to the limited set of keys, to the fact that US dollars are in transit there only for a few hours between a late evening arrival and a mid-morning handoff to armored trucks. The language in internal memos treats the vault as a temporary annex of the banking system, not a warehouse. Money is parked, not stored. The room is an extension of the strong room environment, not a closet above a loading dock. On the balance sheets, those millions in transit are abstract entries shuffled between Lufthansa, Commerzbank, and American correspondents. The building is just the short, boring line on a diagram between them. The security model is essentially a vibe, serious words, serious partners, serious doors, therefore serious safety. Zoom in from the memos to the perimeter and the vibe gets translated into hardware that is, by 1978 standards, adequate but not exactly Fort Knox. JFK's cargo zone is fenced with chain link and razor wire. Vehicle gates at the outer ring are watched by Port Authority Police Department officers sitting in booths with clipboards and radios. Personnel doors on the buildings require keys or push-button codes that are supposed to change periodically. Building 261's alarm system, installed years earlier and only sporadically updated, runs from magnetic contacts and motion detectors back to a remote monitoring center operated by a contract firm. A control panel near the supervisor's office lets an authorized employee arm and disarm different zones with a metal key and a numeric code, and the system is wired so that forcing open certain doors or leaving both vault doors open at once is meant to trigger a call to PAPD. The overnight crew swipe or show ID badges to get into the cargo compound. Forklifts and tugs move under banks of sodium vapor lamps that wash the inner roads in orange light. Patrol cars cruise preset loops at intervals measured in minutes, not hours. To anyone looking from the outside, this looks like the late Cold War version of high security, electronics, badges, flashing light bars, and acronyms. Scale does the rest of the psychological work. By the late 1970s, JFK is handling tens of millions of passengers a year and hundreds of thousands of tons of freight, spread across low brick and concrete cargo buildings numbered in the 200s and 300s, plus the more glamorous terminals closer to the runways. At any given hour, dozens of wide-body jets are climbing out or flaring for landing, thousands of vehicles, fuel tankers, catering trucks, baggage tugs, crew buses, are threading the taxiways and service roads. For the people drawing security diagrams, this density makes the idea of granular control laughable. So they design for statistical comfort, watch the main vehicle gates, run spot checks on ID cards, respond when alarms ring, and assume that anything bearing Lufthansa livery and the right paperwork is legitimate. Regulatory attention in the 1970s has been focused on hijacking and bombs in passenger cabins, not forklifts in warehouse bays. So, airport security, as a phrase, conjures X-ray machines and sky marshals rather than bored night staff eating sandwiches at 3 in the morning. If you drew their mental model, you'd have one rectangle labeled Secure Airport Complex, a smaller one inside it labeled Building 261, and an unspoken belief that enclosing a box in another box changes the universe's attitude toward crime. Inside the smaller rectangle, the actual security stack is modest. The ground floor is a working warehouse, loading docks along one side, roller doors opening onto bays where cargo pallets are staged, forklifts humming along painted lanes, export and import counters separated by partitions and clipboards. Upstairs are offices, a break room with vending machines and plastic tables, and the valuables vault, a reinforced room reached by a short corridor and guarded by a heavy steel door with a combination lock. Access is controlled less by lasers and more by habit. Only certain supervisors on the currency shift are entrusted with the combination and the physical key. So in theory the vault can only be opened when both personal presence and mechanical permission line up. A second steel door and a 10 by 20 foot antechamber create a crude interlock, open inner door plus outer door at the same time, and the alarm should trip. On paper, this is a simple, robust design, narrow choke points, clear lines of authority, a small number of humans whose signatures and keyrings stand between Lufthansa and catastrophe. In reality, every one of those design decisions is quietly delegating risk to the same species that forgets to lock its own apartment. The gap between story and physics is exactly where the tip about the vault lands. By the time word of building 261's cash pipeline has migrated from a Lufthansa cargo agent's panic to a Brooklyn bar table, the official diagrams are just raw material for a different kind of systems analysis. The man who brings the problem into that room is the same underpaid supervisor whose job description includes escorting Brinks guards upstairs with bulging canvas bags and flipping the alarm panel at the end of a shift. He knows, down to the day of the week, how often Friday night shipments from Frankfurt hit the airport, how they sometimes sit until Monday because of scheduling, and what the paperwork looks like when a pickup is delayed. He also knows that nobody at Lufthansa is checking his gambling markers. 2 years earlier, in 1976, he and a friend quietly peeled about $22,000 in foreign currency out of the system, a miniature inside job that went undetected long enough to convince him the vault's defenses are brittle. When he starts whispering about a score in early 1978, he is not reciting the brochure, he is reciting the building's muscle memory, when the alarm is switched off, when the night crew go for coffee, when a missed Brinks run leaves cash sitting upstairs for days. Once that knowledge hits James Burke's side of the table, the tone of the whole enterprise shifts from gossip to design work. Burke has already watched a smaller inside job succeed at the same airport, the 1967 Air France robbery, which netted roughly $420,000 in cash from a different airline's cargo vault using a similar combination of insider tip, after-hours access, and an assumption that nobody would stage an armed robbery in a building full of paperwork. That earlier score taught him two crucial quantitative lessons, that a vault on airport property can be softer than a bank downtown, and that an institution's faith in its own routines is sometimes worth more than its deadbolts. Now he is being told that Lufthansa has scaled the stakes up by more than an order of magnitude, moving roughly $5 million in US currency per month through that upstairs room and occasionally letting a full shipment sit untouched for an entire weekend. From Burke's point of view, this isn't just a robbery prospect, it's an invitation to run a larger experiment on the same system. Reconnaissance begins not with binoculars but with calendars and questions. Burke and his associates press their source on timing. When do Brinks trucks normally arrive on Fridays? How many people are typically on duty between midnight and 4 a.m. on a Monday? How far, in actual walking steps, is it from the break room to the vault corridor? Which supervisors are punctual and which drift in late enough that you could count on them being elsewhere when the shooting starts? The answers are not poetic. They are numbers, 10 or 11 employees in the building overnight, of whom 1 or 2 can actually open the vault, a lull between about 3 and 4 in the morning when flights are sparse, phones quiet, and most of the work is either done or deferred. They sketch floor plans on bar napkins, rectangles for the warehouse, lines for stairwells, a little square for the supervisor's office, and a box standing in for the vault. They mark where the alarm panel sits on the wall, where the break room door opens, where the stair from the east tower deposits you onto the mezzanine. It is architecture translated into a checklist: seize this room, control that person, and the advertised security features cascade into irrelevance. Only after the paper reckon is done does anyone from the crew start treating Building 261 as a physical problem to be probed. Throughout late November 1978, cars connected to Burke's circle drift through the cargo roads at various hours, doing loops past the Lufthansa building and its neighbors. The men inside aren't sightseeing, they are running crude sampling experiments on the port authority's response patterns. One night a sedan parks a little too long near a side door to see how quickly a patrol car swings by and whether the officer merely slows down or stops and questions the driver. Another night, someone tugs experimentally on a supposedly locked personnel in trance during a lull in traffic, noting whether it catches or gives. There are small disturbances, a rattled gate, a phoned-in anonymous tip, maybe an intentionally sloppy parking job, that test the difference between someone shows up in 2 minutes, annoyed, and somebody logs it as a glitch and resets an alarm panel half an hour later. The goal is to map the airport's nervous system by poking it, gently, with a stick. At the same time, the crew are trying to turn those qualitative impressions into a quantitative schedule they can trust with their lives. They have no whiteboards or spreadsheets, but they do have overlapping memories of previous robberies, notebooks with dates and times of patrol sightings, and Werner's recollection of how long it takes a supervisor to be roused from his desk, walk to the alarm panel, and climb the stairs to the vault. When you lay those inputs on top of each other, a rough but usable timeline emerges, perhaps a minute or less from burst through door to having guns visible in the warehouse, a couple of minutes to corral the scattered night crew into the break room and get tape or cord on their wrists, another 3 or 4 minutes to march the one man with a vault key to the panel and make him disarm the alarm, 10 minutes to work the double door sequence without tripping any interlocks, 15 or 20 minutes more to haul cash cartons down to a waiting vehicle. Add a small buffer for mistakes and fear, subtract the response lag built into human institutions, and you arrive at something like the 6 to 4 minute working window that later case files reconstruct. Entry around 3 a.m., vault open by roughly 3:30, departure before 4:15, first 911 calls not reaching anyone in authority until the van is already off airport property. One advantage Burke has that Lufthansa's security consultants don't is a veteran guide who has literally walked similar corridors at night with larceny on his mind. Robert Frenchie McMahon, one of the men brought into the crew, worked cargo before and helped pull off the Air France job a decade earlier. He knows viscerally how sound behaves in those long concrete hallways, how footsteps on metal stairs announce themselves a few seconds before a body appears in a doorway, how a forklift backing up on the loading dock can mask the click of a lock. When he is briefed on Building 261's layout, East Tower stairs leading up to offices, warehouse floor stretching out under fluorescent tubes, vault corridor tucked behind an unmarked door, he is not hearing theory. He is remembering the feel of similar rooms and judging, with depressing accuracy, where a man with a gun could stand in shadow and not be seen for a full minute. His presence converts Werner's anxious storytelling into something closer to a field manual. Out of this blend of insider detail and street-level observation comes a map that would never appear in an insurance dossier but is priceless to people planning a robbery. It highlights, not walls and doors, but choke points in the human flow. The break room where 2 or 3 workers reliably gather for coffee between 3 and 3:30, the telex desk where another sits alone at a screen, the routes workers use to cut behind stacks of freight rather than walking the long way around. There is a storage closet whose door opens onto a narrow service corridor bypassing the busier parts of the floor. If you come in that way, you can appear at the vault stair without ever crossing the main sorting area. The stairwell itself has an acoustic quirk. Footsteps on the metal treads echo in such a way that someone at the top can hear bodies coming long before they are visible. The corridor leading to the high-value room makes a right-angled dogleg behind an unlabeled fire door, meaning that once you push through it, you're in a blind spot no one on the warehouse floor can see. To the people who work there, these are just shortcuts. To the crew, they are places where time can be stolen. The perimeter, too, turns out to be more social than architectural. Officially, every exterior door in Building 261 is part of an alarmed boundary. Practically, several of them are only as secure as the last person's smoke break. Investigators will later conclude that on the night of the heist the robbers probably entered through a side door left unlocked or deliberately jimmied so it could be opened from the outside. There are hints in later FBI interviews of a second Lufthansa insider, never conclusively identified, whose role may have been as simple and devastating as failing to throw a deadbolt at the right time. That is the kind of vulnerability the official story cannot admit, that control over which side of the fence you stand on at 3 in the morning has been ceded to a handful of underpaid workers with union cards and, in some cases, acquaintances in the same Queen's bars where Burke holds court. The boundary around millions in cash is, in effect, a matter of personal reliability plus whatever leverage organized crime can bring to bear. Zoom the frame out from the building to the broader social graph and you see another layer of secret infrastructure, this one connecting mafia families rather than doors. JFK's cargo district is informally understood to be Gambino territory, dominated by their control over freight handling unions and trucking contracts. For a Lufthansa-aligned crew to run a major job there without checking in would risk not only retaliation but a shooting war. So before anyone starts timing patrol cars, Burke uses his relationship with Lucci's capo Paul Vario to obtain a form of political clearance. A cut of the proceeds will go to a Gambino representative, generally identified later as Paolo Licastri, reputedly somewhere around $200,000 on a projected $5 to $6 million haul. That payment is not just tribute, it is a way of routing risk. In the same way a multinational spreads liability among subsidiaries, the heist's exposure is spread across three outfits: Lufthansa and its bankers, oblivious to what is coming, the Lucchese family, fronting the crew, and the Gambinos, lending territorial permission. None of this appears on any org chart, but it has the same practical effect as a forgotten key policy: it determines who can walk through which door without getting shot. By late November 1978, the combination of these physical and social maps has turned Building 261, in the minds of Burke's people, from a secure facility into a solvable timing puzzle. They know there will be about 10 or 11 workers on the night shift. They have identified the one or two whose signatures can open the vault. They understand where those men sit relative to the alarm panel and how long it takes to walk them from their chairs to the stairs under duress. They have tested the outer perimeter enough to be reasonably confident that a side door can be opened without immediately lighting up the PAPD radio net. They have watched patrol cars come and go, counted the minutes between sightings, and noticed that the airport's response energy is tuned to recurring nuisances, false alarms, minor thefts, misplaced cargo, rather than once-in-a-generation armed robberies. In other words, they have performed, with crude tools, the same kind of threat modeling an expensive security consultancy might do, except their mitigation strategy involves balaclavas. The final ingredient is calendar sabotage. The insider in the building understands that the vault is most vulnerable not at some random hour but at the intersection of maximum cash on hand and minimum institutional attention. In early December 1978, when a large shipment of US dollars arrives from Frankfurt on a Friday, he simply refuses to hand it over to Brinks on schedule, citing missing paperwork and the absence of a supervisor authorized to sign the release. In the bland language of airline logistics, it's a minor delay. In the physics of risk, it is a bomb-proofing failure. Millions of dollars that should have been inside armored trucks rolling toward Manhattan banks are left sitting in cartons in an upstairs room, behind doors whose combinations are known to a man drowning in about $20,000 of personal gambling debt. By the time Sunday night slides into the small hours of Monday, the 11th of December, that one bureaucratic non-action has created the richest single point of failure in the American cash transfer system. What Burke's crew possess, on that night, is not just courage or cruelty but an extremely detailed mental simulation of how that failure can be exploited minute by minute. They know the approximate weight of each cash carton, about 15 pounds of bundled 50s and 100s, and how many such boxes it would take to reach the expected total of around $5 million, plus the additional metal container of jewelry shipments worth almost another $1 million. They have a sense, from their dry runs and Werner's recollections, of how noise will travel through the stairwell, how long-bound employees in the break room will need to work a hidden telephone free, and how many minutes of slack lie between the warning they can bark at hostages and the moment a Port Authority dispatcher picks up a phone and starts asking bewildered questions about guns in a cargo building. Somewhere in Queens, a black Ford Econoline van and a backup car are already waiting to turn the model into a test. The only unknown variable left in their equation is whether, when those vehicles nose into the dim service roads that curl around Building 261, the real structure will behave like the one they have constructed in their heads, or remind them, abruptly, that concrete and human beings have a way of not following scripts. By the time the van noses out of the Lufthansa cargo yard, the science experiment inside Building 261 is over and the experiment in not getting caught has started. It is still the early hours of Monday, the 11th of December, 1978. 10 or 11 employees are on the floor, wrists taped, legs bound, warned not to reach a phone for at least 15 minutes. Somewhere between $5 and $6 million in US currency and about $875,000 in gemstones are in the back of a white Ford Econoline that was itself stolen days earlier. The van rolls away from JFK's cargo loop into the unremarkable night traffic of Queens, past sodium lights and snow-dusted shoulder piles. Inside are 6 men who have just spent roughly 90 minutes turning Lufthansa's valuables vault into a temporary negative space on Commerzbank's balance sheet, and who now have a very specific problem. New York City wakes up on a schedule, and every minute that passes increases the odds that a Port Authority patrol car or a random fender bender will turn their mobile vault into a crime scene. The first stop is not some cinematic mob mansion, it is an auto shop in Canarsie, a working-class pocket of Brooklyn where nobody asks why a garage door is rattling open at 4 in the morning. The Econoline backs into the bay, the metal door comes down, and the loot crosses a critical boundary, from Port Authority property into private, unsupervised space. Inside the concrete box, Burke has staged 2 utterly ordinary sedans with empty trunks and clean registrations. The men recreate the conveyor belt they just ran in reverse, metal boxes off the van floor, into car trunks, rubber-strapped bank bags stacked like bricks, trunk lid slammed. Burke and his son Frank take one car, Manry, McMahon, DeSimone, and Sepe pile into the other. The van, now empty, is meant to exit the narrative altogether. Parnell, Stax, Edwards is supposed to drive it to a Gambino-connected junkyard in New Jersey, where a hydraulic press, a falsified intake ticket, and a cutting torch will transform a rolling catalogue of fingerprints, fibers, tool marks, and cargo tags into a 1-meter cube of scrap steel. In a world without license plate readers or networked CCTV, destroying the vehicle is as close as you get to deleting your browser history. On paper, the hardest part has already been solved. This is not a bank-bait car where every serial number has been photocopied. It is a shipment of used 50s and 100s in cloth bags, counted and banded weeks earlier in Frankfurt by Commerzbank clerks who will never set foot in Queens. Those German banking codes stamped on the straps might impress an insurance adjuster in Hamburg, but they mean nothing to a bartender on Rockaway Boulevard. No die packs, no radio tags, no circulating list of serials. The jewelry, gold chains, loose stones, small luxury pieces packed in foam, is even slipperier. A few hours at a Borough Park workshop and a jeweler's torch can melt an engraved bracelet down into anonymous scrap or reset diamonds into a ring that never technically belonged to Lufthansa. Decades later, no prosecutor, insurer, or Lufthansa accountant will be able to point to a specific diamond in a specific necklace and say, with evidentiary confidence, that came out of Building 261. The money and the gems move at different speeds through different networks, but the physics is the same. Once they cross a few transactional borders, they become statistically indistinguishable from every other dollar and stone in New York. Burke's answer to that terrifying freedom is redundancy and hoarding. No single stash is allowed to hold more than a sliver of the take. No single associate outside his tightest circle is told where all the hiding places are. Bundles vanish into false walls behind cheap paneling, into concrete floored basements under friends' houses in Howard Beach, into the back of a safe at Robert's Lounge that has never seen a legitimate deposit slip. The geographic footprint stretches across at least 2 boroughs. The informational footprint is compressed inside Burke's head. On the accounting side, Werner's original description of the opportunity, a couple of million in the vault, tops, had been the basis for promised cuts of maybe $10,000 to $50,000 per participant, which is already several years' legitimate income for a cargo handler making $15,000 or $20,000 a year. When the true figure comes in closer to 5.8 million, simple division suggests each core player could, in theory, be walking toward a life-changing share in the neighborhood of $750,000. Burke reacts not like a genie but like a risk officer at a shaky bank. He slows payouts, bans conspicuous consumption, and quietly keeps most of the cash centralized under his own control. Rational if you're frightened of federal task forces, infuriating if you've just helped move what feels like half a metric ton of money and you are still riding the subway to your borrowed apartment. For a few days, the Lufthansa universe seems split into 2 non-communicating layers. On one layer, managers and port authority detectives walk the warehouse, noting scuff marks where boxes hit the floor, the positions of chairs where employees were taped, the timestamps on alarm logs that show the system switched off and back on again between roughly 3 o'clock and 4:30 a.m. They can see that some of the masked men knew first names and nicknames, that they went straight to the Val room without wondering, that an insider must have stalled Brinks on the previous Friday to keep that $5 million shipment sitting over the weekend. On the other layer, in Queens and Brooklyn bars, the thieves argue over envelopes and fantasize about down payments on Long Island houses while staring at Burke, who refuses to hand over anything bigger than a few thousand. The only physical bridge between worlds is the Econoline, which by design should already be a compressed cube somewhere in New Jersey and instead is parked, very much intact, on a Brooklyn side street, silently advertising one of the oldest rules of exfiltration: if the getaway vehicle survives longer than your lies do, you've built the system wrong. Stax Edwards is the bug in that system. 32 years old, a part-time blues guitarist and full-time hijack driver, he has exactly one job on the 11th of December. Take the empty van from the Canarsie garage to the Gottelinked salvage yard, hand over the keys, walk away. He is given that task precisely because it requires no improvisation, just a straight shot on surface roads and one conversation with a foreman who has crushed plenty of stolen cars without asking questions. Instead, according to later FBI reconstructions, Edwards drives the Ford to his girlfriend's place in East New York, parks it badly, right up against a fire hydrant on East 95th Street, and disappears into a fog of cocaine, marijuana, and misplaced confidence. On the 13th of December, ordinary NYPD patrol officers doing the unglamorous work of writing parking tickets run the plate, discover that the van is stolen, and have it towed to an impound lot. There, investigators notice that it matches the description of the Lufthansa vehicle and sits squarely in the right time window, and that its interior is a forensic buffet, airline cargo tags, tape, and even eyeglasses belonging to one of the bound employees. Fingerprint powder turns latent prints on the steering wheel and door handles into index data points, including several matching Edwards' existing criminal file. With one lazy parking job, a beautiful van to junkyard plan becomes a direct line from Building 261 to a guy who plays guitar in mob bars. Burke's correction mechanism is not a stern performance review. In the week after the heist, while Lufthansa executives are holding crisis meetings in Manhattan and the Port Authority is arguing with Lufthansa security about who turned which key when, Burke sends Tommy DeSimone and Angelo Sepe to make an even less reversible adjustment. On the morning of the 18th of December, 1978, the two Luchis associates let themselves into an apartment in Queens where Edwards is known to crash. DeSimone carries a small caliber handgun with a crude suppressor. Sepe plays lookout and backup. Edwards, caught groggy in bed, is shot multiple times. Neighbors may register a dull thump or two. In a city that records over 1,000 homicides a year, one more gangland murder barely ripples the statistics. For the FBI, when they inevitably match the dead van driver to the van fingerprints, it is both confirmation and obstruction. Confirmation because the timing and victim scream, Lufthansa cleanup. Obstruction because the one man they could have put in a lineup next to shaken cargo clerks is now a file folder in the morgue. Meanwhile, the investigative side is scaling up from, "we've had a robbery," to, "we're at war with the system." PAPD officers who responded to the alarm on the morning of the 11th processed the scene with fingerprint kits and Polaroids. Within days, the FBI's New York field office has designated Lufthansa a major theft case and spun up a joint task force with NYPD detectives and Port Authority investigators. They set up a shared office, pull thousands of pages of time cards and shift rosters from Lufthansa, and start the boring, essential work of correlation, which employees were on duty during earlier, smaller thefts, who took sick days around the 11th of December, who was gambling markers at Queens bookmakers, which known hijackers have been haunting the cargo area. Agents such as Joel Weiss and James Callstrom in the major theft and organized crime squads, and Assistant U.S. Attorney Edward McDonald in Brooklyn, begin wiring phones, tailing suspects out of Robert's Lounge, and listening to hours of ambient wise guy conversation, hoping that somebody's ego or drunkenness will hand them phrases that can survive cross-examination. Inside Burke's world, the Lufthansa money starts distorting gravity. Within days he throws a modest party at Robert's Lounge, ostensibly to celebrate a banner year. Henry Hill, who has been orbiting Burke since the Air France vault job in 1967, will later tell Nicholas Pileggi that the scene felt like a Queen-scale IPO. Trays of food, a jammed bar, everybody smelling like cigarette smoke and adrenaline. It is also, from an operational standpoint, a disaster. A crew member pulls up in a brand new Cadillac bought for cash, another man's wife arrives in a mink coat whose retail price would swallow several years of a longshoreman's wage. Across the street, FBI surveillance teams jot down license plates and take mental note of exactly which faces are suddenly dressed like they have foreign exchange desks in their basements. Burke sees both sides, the parade of fur and Detroit steel and the parked bureau sedans, and reportedly erupts. The same man who carefully spread cash across false walls and basements is now staring at colleagues who have turned risk management into a fashion show. That panic, amplified by cocaine, rumor, and the knowledge that a van has already gone sideways, feeds directly into the next phase, the part of the Lufthansa story that looks, statistically, less like a heist and more like a small war. The hit list begins with talkers and men on the margin. Marty Krugman, the wig shop bookmaker whose airport gossip and debts helped Werner bring the opportunity to Burke's attention, keeps nagging for his cut and, fatally, lets it slip to more than one person that something big is coming at JFK. In early January 1979 he is scheduled to meet with agents, then simply never shows, his barbershop in Queens shutters, his body has never been found. Within that same month, a different kind of removal occurs. On the 14th of January, 1979, Tommy DeSimone vanishes, widely believed to have been murdered by the Gambino family in retaliation for an earlier killing of made man Billy Batts. Not technically a Lufthansa-ordered hit, but functionally useful to Burke, who now has one fewer volatile gunman with a working memory of the heist. In February, the dismembered remains of Teresa Ferrara, a Long Island beauty salon owner rumored to have handled some Lufthansa jewelry, turn up in a New Jersey marsh. In late April or early May, Joe, Buddha, Mamrie and Robert, Frenchie, McMahon, both crucial to the airport phase of the robbery, are lured into a bic, shot in the head, and dumped on a Brooklyn street. Their bodies are discovered on the 16th of May, 1979. On the 13th of June, Gambino family liaison Paolo Licastri, who had helped broker the mob politics of the job, is found riddled with bullets on top of a burning trash heap. By mid-1979, aside from Burke and a few lower-level hangers-on, almost everyone directly tied to the JFK raid is dead. From a systems perspective, this is criminal self-policing. The cleanup murders do what the alarm panel at Lufthansa could not: suppress signal. Each dead man removes a possible cooperating witness from the pool of future grand jury testimony. Each corpse also adds another investigative file to NYPD's homicide squads, which are already drowning in work. The FBI's own internal records acknowledge that thousands of man-hours go into Lufthansa between 1978 and 1980. Wiretaps, stakeouts, grand juries, yet every time they try to tighten the circle, somebody inside that circle ends up in a trunk or on a medical examiner's table. Agents know, in the same way astrophysicists know about black holes, that Burke sits at the center of the gravity well. Informants report that he is paranoid, that he complains about not wanting to share, that he has effectively vaporized his own crew. But knowing and proving are different universes. The cleanup phase also has a perverse secondary effect. By annihilating the Luchis-linked JFK hijack crew, Burke removes the ready-made team for any repeat performance, which arguably does more for airport security in 1979 than any port authority memo. Legally, the system can least afford to lose the inside man, so it does the only thing it can: it grabs Louis Werner. On the 11th of January, 1979, a federal grand jury in the Eastern District of New York indicts Werner and his associate Peter Grunwald on charges including Hobbs Act robbery, conspiracy, and theft from an interstate shipment, weaving together evidence from the Lufthansa raid and a smaller 1976 inside job Werner had engineered. Grunwald, already quietly cooperating, surrenders. Werner is arrested at home. The case, heard before Judge Jack Weinstein, leans heavily on documents and patterns, records showing Werner turned away Brinks on the 8th of December, 1978. Phone calls linking him to Krugman and known Luchis associates, proof that the 1976 theft followed an almost identical pattern of delayed armored pickup and after-hours vault access. In February 1980, a jury convicts Werner. He is eventually sentenced to 15 years. The Second Circuit Court of Appeals will uphold the conviction that same year, explicitly treating Lufthansa as an outgrowth of Werner's earlier manipulation of his employer. Werner, however, never publicly names Burke or the gunman, clinging until his release in the mid-1980s to the belief, or fantasy, that silence will be rewarded by the very network that left him holding the bag. Into this thinning ecosystem steps Henry Hill, and not because he has suddenly developed a conscience. By 1980, Hill is under indictment for cocaine trafficking and deals gone bad. He is also reading the obituaries. He knows Edwards is dead, Krugman has vanished, Manry and McMahon have been pulled out of a bick, and rumor has DeSimone buried in some unmarked patch of Queen's clay. Hill understands Burke's logic well enough to see where the curve is headed. If Lufthansa is the biggest single score of Burke's career, then anyone who might someday trade information about Lufthansa for their own freedom is an unacceptable variable. According to Hill's later accounts, there is a specific moment when the math clicks: it's Lufthansa. I'm dead. It's over. That dread drives him into a room with AUSA Edward MacDonald and FBI agents, where over days of debriefings he unspools the full story of the heist and the murders, the planning sessions at Robert's Lounge, Werner's role in turning away Brinks, the lineup of gunmen at JFK, the Canarsie garage, the hydrant, the hits. Hill's cooperation gives law enforcement, for the first time, a complete narrative spine that matches and enriches what little paper trail they have. He testifies before a federal grand jury in 1980, walking jurors through everything from the layout of Building 261 to the reason Louis roast beef. Kafora's wife Joanna ended up in a fur coat that would effectively mark both of them for death. Prosecutors now have a human voice tying together the van in Canarsie, the Brinks delay, the murdered participants, the odd phone calls, and the baffled cargo clerks who heard robbers use their nicknames. But grand juries are not true crime podcasts. They demand more than a charismatic storyteller with a felony record. Without surviving co-conspirators to corroborate Hill's version, and without physical evidence that survives the inevitable defense attack on his credibility as a drug-addled accomplice, the U.S. Attorney's Office decides not to indict Burke for Lufthansa itself. Instead, they deploy Hill's information where the evidentiary bar is lower or the paper trail thicker, point shaving at Boston College in 1978-79. The 1979 murder of drug dealer Richard Eaton, a lattice of extortion and fraud charges that eventually put both Burke and Luchis capo Paul Vario behind bars for other crimes. Lufthansa remains, in the charging language, conspicuously absent. What you end up with, by the early 1980s, is a kind of legal negative image of the heist. The money is gone, atomized into shopping bags, buried coffee cans, and maybe the construction budgets of a tavern or two. Not a single dollar or jewel has ever been officially recovered. The original crew is mostly dead, their deaths technically unsolved, even as agents and mob reporters can draw arrows from Burke's name to each murder on a whiteboard. Only Werner carries an explicit Lufthansa conviction on his record. Burke dies in prison in 1996 serving time for unrelated offences. Hill outlives most of them in and out of witness protection. His memories turned into books and, eventually, film. Grand juries have heard the story and declined to give it a docket number. From the point of view of code and institutions, Lufthansa is the perfect crime not because it was invisible in December 1978, it absolutely was not, but because the people running it built, perhaps unconsciously, a destructive delay function. By the time a coherent narrative emerges in 1980, the witnesses have been shot, the evidence has been crushed or buried, and the statute of limitations clock is ticking in the background like a smug little metronome. Whatever else you call that, it is spectacular risk management, if you are willing to measure risk in bodies. By the time the case makes it into a federal courtroom, the Lufthansa heist already looks less like a robbery than like a mass casualty event with a bookkeeping problem. In January 1979, a grand jury in the Eastern District of New York indicts Louis Werner, the gambling-addicted Lufthansa cargo employee, and his friend Peter Grunwald on conspiracy and theft from interstate shipment counts tied to the 1978 raid and an earlier 1976 inside job. A few months later, Werner sits at the defense table before Judge Jack B. Weinstein, with prosecutors stitching together bank records, timesheets, and testimony from co-workers who remembered just how convenient it was that Brinks was told to come back another day. Agents can't put Werner in a ski mask in Building 261, but they can show that he delayed the armored car pickup, knew the vault routines down to the key rings, and had already helped skim the airline once. The jury convicts. In 1980, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals upholds the verdict, explicitly calling the 1976 and 1978 thefts of similar character. Werner is sentenced to 15 years. He becomes the only human being the United States ever locks up specifically for Lufthansa, the sole dot of ink on a legal map otherwise crowded with corpses and rumors. That lopsided outcome is not for lack of bureaucratic enthusiasm. By early 1979, the Lufthansa task force has eaten office space in Queens and several thousand agent hours from the FBI, NYPD, and Port Authority Police. Investigators pull fingerprints from the abandoned Ford Econoline, cross-reference them with arrest files, and match them to Parnell, Stax, Edwards, and a few other familiar names. They subpoena everyone from baggage handlers to bookmakers, feed license plates spotted at Roberts Lounge into index card databases, and run wiretaps on phones belonging to Burke's Circle. Grand juries sit in 1979 and 1980, listening to witnesses describe cash-stuffed bags, late-night meetings, and cars that were never seen again. The physics of the problem, however, are brutal. The van yields no clear trail beyond confirming that someone from Burke's orbit drove it. No recovered money can be tied to a specific crate. The only people who could narrate the walk from the break room to the vault are either terrified, dead, or both. By mid-1979, almost the entire known robbery crew has been shot, disappeared, or dumped on Brooklyn's side streets, usually with a bullet in the head and a Lufthansa-adjacent motive written between the lines of the homicide reports. The longer investigators take, the more their sample size literally shrinks. The one witness with a panoramic view arrives too late. In 1980, Henry Hill finds himself cornered by his own portfolio, cocaine trafficking indictments, a violated parole, and a growing suspicion that Jimmy Burke has added his name to the cleanup list. The calculus is simple enough to do on a napkin: stay in Queens, risk an accident, and face decades in state and federal prison, or flip. Hill chooses cooperation. Over months of debriefings in safe offices and motel rooms, he walks agents through more than 20 years of Lucci's family business, the 1967 Air France vault robbery at JFK, mid-1970s freight hijackings, the slow suffocation of debtors who couldn't pay, and, nested among them, the Lufthansa job. He names Burke as the organizer, sketches the crew, and recounts the sequence of celebration, paranoia, and murder that followed. His information helps prosecutors bring racketeering and fraud cases that put Lucci's capo Paul Vario in prison and, later, contributes to Burke's own downfall on unrelated charges. What it cannot do is rewind the statute of limitations. By the time Hill is talking, the 5-year clock on the core federal theft counts is expiring, several suspects are already buried, and the surviving ones are insulated by the absence of physical evidence. Lufthansa has become a dead star, visible in every other case's gravity, unreachable on its own terms. So the law does what bureaucracies do when they can't hit the bull's eye: it fires at the surrounding rings. In 1982, federal prosecutors in New Jersey convict Burke in the Boston College point shaving scandal, where basketball players agreed to manipulate game scores for mob bettors. In 1985, New York State tries him for the murder of Richard Eaton, whose body is discovered hogtied in the back of a refrigerated truck on Long Island. He receives long sentences in both cases and will die in a Buffalo prison hospital in 1996, never having been charged with Lufthansa itself. Vario, the man who provided Burke with cover and a conduit to Lucci's bosses, goes down in 1984 on fraud and extortion counts rooted in Hill's testimony. None of these indictments mentions Lufthansa on the charge sheet, but Lufthansa is everywhere in the background. The money from the heist financed the lifestyle that exposed Hill. The paranoia from the murders pushed him into the arms of the FBI. The visibility of the robbery helped sell judges and juries on the idea that this was not a charming neighborhood crew but a sustained criminal enterprise that needed to be dismantled piece by piece. Even after Burke dies, Lufthansa continues to haunt the bureaucracy like a cold case with a particularly flashy wardrobe. In 2013, FBI teams armed with ground-penetrating radar and a search warrant dig up the yard of Burke's old family home in Queens and recover bones later identified as those of Paul Katz, a garment industry businessman who disappeared in 1969 after allegedly helping Burke store stolen goods. The dig does nothing for Lufthansa directly, but it offers a proof of concept. The rumors that bodies were literally buried in the orbit of this crew keep turning out to be true. The following year, in January 2014, agents arrest Vincent Acero, an aging Bonanno captain in his late 70s, on a sweeping racketeering indictment that lists the Lufthansa robbery as one predicate act among many, alongside the Katz murder and hijackings and armed robberies stretching back to the late 1960s. Prosecutors lean heavily on taped conversations recorded by Acero's cousin, Gaspar Valenti, in which the old man complains that Jimmy cheated him out of his share of that airport thing, and on a small parade of cooperating mobsters whose memories get foggier the closer you get to the actual vault. The Acero trial in 2015 plays like a strange hybrid of true crime retrospective and historical reenactment. Jurors see grainy photographs of Lufthansa's Building 261 taken by agents in 1979, listen to transcripts of wiretaps that once ran over copper phone lines, and have Hill's already published account read back to them at one remove by newer witnesses. The government's theory is clear. Burke and Acero organized the heist together, expected roughly $750,000 each, and then fell out when Burke hoarded the cash. The defense's theory is even simpler. This is a story assembled from the grievances of informants who would like to shorten their own sentences and from memoirs written by a man who has been dead since 2012. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberates for 2 days and acquits Acero on all Lufthansa-related counts. He walks out of the Brooklyn courthouse grinning, 80 years old and legally innocent of the case that has defined his public biography. From an evidentiary point of view, the verdict is unsurprising. Trying to reconstruct a tightly held conspiracy nearly 4 decades later, without new physical exhibits, is like trying to reassemble a shredded ledger after someone has eaten half the confetti. If the court record ends in ellipses, the cultural record ends in bold type. Within 24 hours of the robbery, the Associated Press is already moving copy that calls Lufthansa the largest cash theft ever on American soil, and the New York tabloids treat it as proof that the city's institutions are literally leaking money. In December 1978 and January 1979, front pages pair photographs of snow-covered cargo bays and baffled Port Authority cops with headlines about transit strikes and budget crises. The mood music is everything is falling apart, including the airports. Every time a Lufthansa-linked body turns up, Stax Edwards in an East New York apartment, Marty Krugman vanishing on his way to a meeting, Joe Manry and Frenchie McMahon found shot in a BIC, the press spikes the story back into public attention. You can watch the narrative harden in real time, not just a heist, but the heist, the one where millions vanish into Queens basements and half the people who touched the money end up in trunks, meat lockers, or anonymous graves. Nicholas Pileggi's 1985 book Wise Guy takes that tabloid scaffolding and replaces it with something sturdier and more unsettling. Working from hundreds of hours of interviews with Hill, prosecutors, and agents, he builds a biography of Henry's life in which Lufthansa sits almost exactly at the hinge point between rise and fall. The numbers are concrete. According to Hill, Burke promised core participants something like $750,000 apiece, a sum that dwarfed a union cargo handler's $20,000 annual salary and even the take from earlier scores like the $420,000 Air France robbery. The rules are precise: no new cars, no fur coats, no conspicuous spending until the heat dies down. The violations are specific: a pink Cadillac bought on the 22nd of December, minks that still smell of department store perfume, cash-only house deposits that make agents' notebooks itch. Pileggi follows Hill through that Christmas party at Robert's Lounge, through the creeping horror as more and more names get crossed off his mental address book, and into the moment when Hill realizes that the biggest score of their careers has also destroyed the only social universe he understands. Wise Guy is not a neutral document. Hill is a gifted storyteller with every incentive to dramatize, but it becomes the template against which later versions of the Lufthansa story are measured. When Martin Scorsese adapts Wise Guy into Goodfellas in 1990, he makes a formally perverse choice that turns out to be perfect for the story. He refuses to give the audience a big, operatic heist sequence. On screen, the Lufthansa job is glimpsed in fragments: men in masks moving through a generic warehouse, a shouted command here, a door kicked there, and then we cut almost immediately to the after montage. Derek and the Dominoes, Layla, piano coda plays while the camera glides past a frozen cargo truck, the pink Cadillac, and the bloody meat locker where one of the crew hangs like so much beef. For legal reasons, names are slightly altered. Jimmy Burke becomes Jimmy Conway, Tommy DeSimone morphs into Tommy DeVito, but the beats track the case files with unnerving fidelity: the botched disposal of the van, the disappearance of a complaining bookmaker, the string of murders rationalized as business. The effect is to nudge the viewer's attention away from the mechanics of the robbery and toward the psychology of its consequences. You see less of how the vault was opened and more of how the people who opened it implode. Outside the cinema, Lufthansa's afterlife morphs from mob gossip into management parable. Security consultants use it as a case study in insider risk. One man with a $20,000 gambling habit, embedded in a poorly audited cargo operation, helps unleash a $5.8 million loss and a trail of collateral damage that spreads across at least 3 crime families. Airport authorities and insurers cite it in the dry language of post-incident reviews. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Port Authority and FAA assessments of JFK's cargo complex flag weaknesses that Lufthansa had exposed, valuables vaults monitored by a single insider, alarms wired to third-party firms with no independent oversight, and unarmed staff handling millions in currency in buildings patrolled only intermittently by police. In response, airports roll out stricter badge controls, more aggressive background checks for cargo employees, dual control requirements for vault keys and alarm codes, and denser camera coverage in the supposedly boring warehouses that had previously escaped attention. The point is not that Lufthansa single-handedly invented modern airport security, it is that it crystallized a problem already there and pushed regulators to admit that air cargo was not just boxes and forklifts but, effectively, a mobile branch of the banking system that needed to be treated accordingly. Law enforcement learns a parallel lesson, not about cameras but about legal architecture. The failure to hang Lufthansa on Burke and Company, despite oceans of circumstantial evidence and later confessions to writers, becomes Exhibit A in internal debates over how to deal with organized crime. Going case by case, a hijacking here, a robbery there leaves too much room for statutes of limitations to run out and for inconvenient witnesses to go missing. By 1980, prosecutors in the Eastern District of New York are leaning harder on the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, which lets them argue that a string of crimes is not a set of isolated events but a pattern of racketeering by a single enterprise. Lufthansa fits neatly into that logic even if it never quite makes it into a successful RICO verdict. The 2014 Acero indictment uses RICO to bundle the 1978 robbery with murders and extortions stretching into the 21st century, trying to smuggle an old heist through the side door of an ongoing conspiracy. The message to future Burkes is clear: even if you beat the robbery count, the phone tolls, the loan shark ledgers, and the murdered debtors can still add up to a life sentence. For all the policy memos it spawned, the heist's most durable legacy may be ethical rather than operational. Hill's stories and Scorsese's visuals strip away whatever Robin Hood glamour clung to the idea of the big score. There is no community uplift, no noble redistribution. The money flows upward to bosses, sideways into gambling debts, and downward into shallow graves. Crew members are killed not for betraying the underclass but for buying a car too early or for knowing the wrong combination of facts. In business schools, Lufthansa sometimes shows up as an allegory with sharper suits. If a leader refuses to share rewards and instead treats collaborators as liabilities, the organization will tear itself apart faster than any regulator can. In criminal justice seminars, it stands as a reminder that deterrence is not just about the severity of punishment but about the perceived probability of getting caught, and here, the underworld's own fear of being whacked did more to enforce silence than any witness protection brochure. From a systems perspective, what went wrong at Building 261 is almost insultingly simple. Lufthansa and its insurers convinced themselves that being inside an international airport was, in itself, a security control. JFK's fences, floodlights, and 3-letter acronyms formed a kind of conceptual force field, If something sits behind all that, the thinking went, then it must be safe. In reality, most of the relevant physics operated at human scale. A side door could be left ajar by a single careless employee. A vault could be opened by one man with the right key and a gun at his head. An alarm could be disarmed by somebody who knew which zones to switch off and when the monitoring company tended to ignore glitches. What Burke's crew exploited was not a lockpicking challenge but a mismatch between how the system imagined itself as a fortress of protocols, and how it actually behaved at 3 in the morning when only a handful of tired workers and one terrified supervisor were on duty. Zoom out further, and Lufthansa looks less like an outlier and more like a particularly well-documented instance of a general rule. Any system that moves high-value assets, cash, data, pharmaceuticals, cryptocurrency, you name it, will eventually discover that its weakest point is wherever it has chosen to outsource trust. In 1978 there was a gambling-addicted cargo clerk in a web of longshoremen, union representatives, and mob fixers who treated crates like poker chips. Today it might be a subcontracted IT administrator with a grudge or a cloud service misconfigured by a sleepy engineer. The physical mechanics have changed, the epistemic problem has not. Someone always knows where the valuables actually are, how often the guards really walk their rounds, and which alarms are more theater than threat. And this is why, decades later, the Lufthansa heist still feels weirdly contemporary. The cargo building has been remodeled, the mob families restructured, and the modern traveler through JFK is more likely to worry about TSA queues than about Lucci's hijackers. But the core puzzle, concentrated value protected by distributed, fallible humans, is everywhere from logistics hubs to server farms. Each new breach gets its own headlines and, if it is cinematic enough, its own film. Very few get a clean courtroom resolution. Most end like Lufthansa, with some partial justice, some improved procedures, a lot of bodies, and a story that keeps being told because it sits at the uncomfortable intersection of engineering, greed, and the stories we tell ourselves about how secure we are.